From the road, the barn looked like any other on the desolate plains of the Wyoming Territory. Its weathered gray timbers, silvered by sun and scoured by wind, stood as a lonely monument to a life hard-lived and prematurely ended. Travelers on the infrequent stagecoach saw only a widow's homestead, a place of quiet sorrow clinging to the edge of civilization. They saw the thin curl of smoke from the main cabin's chimney, the patched fences, the solitary figure of a young woman moving with the weary purpose of one who has no choice but to endure. Nobody noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible changes, the faint dusting of fresh earth scattered in the far pasture, a patch of ground that seemed just a little too dark, a little too rich. Nobody ever saw the heavy trapdoor, artfully concealed beneath a stack of hay bales in the barn's darkest corner. And nobody could have smelled what lay beneath it, the deep, primal scent of damp soil, of cool stone, and the faint, lingering aroma of pine smoke, a secret held tight in the belly of the earth. But soon, a cold was coming that the world had not felt in a generation. It would creep from the north, a silent, white predator, and when it did, the laughter of the town would freeze on their lips. The wisdom of their modern builders and the prayers of their pious minister would offer no warmth. In the heart of that crystalline apocalypse, all eyes would turn to this forgotten barn, to the mad widow and her impossible secret, to the only door that stood between life and a brittle, frozen death. The hardship began not with a bang, but with a lingering, hollow silence. It was the silence left behind by her husband, Thomas, a good man taken by a fever the winter before. Annalise, at only 23, was left with 160 acres of unforgiving land, a small, drafty cabin, and her mother, Martha. Martha, 75 and frail, moved through their small world with the aid of a gnarled wooden walking stick, her hip having never set right after a fall years ago. Each step was a quiet testament to a life of resilience, but her eyes, rheumy and clouded with age, held a deep and constant worry for her daughter. The Wyoming winter was a beast, and their cabin was a flimsy defense against its teeth. Last year, with Thomas there to chop endless cords of wood and stuff the chinks with mud and straw, they had barely survived. Annalise remembered nights spent huddled by the fire, the blankets piled so high they could hardly breathe, yet still the cold seeped through the floorboards, a tangible presence that stole the heat from their very bones. It froze the water in the bucket by the door and left a rime of ice on the nails hammered into the interior walls. Now, Thomas was gone. The axe felt heavier in Annalise's hands, its familiar weight a constant reminder of the arms that once swung it with such ease. Her hands, though calloused, were smaller, her shoulders not as broad. The woodpile, which Thomas had kept like a fortress, now seemed to shrink with every log she burned. She was alone in this fight, save for a mother who could offer wisdom and love, but not the brute strength the land demanded. Have you ever felt so completely alone, facing a challenge so vast it seems to blot out the sun? That was Annalise's world now, a daily battle against entropy, against the slow, creeping victory of the cold. The wind already carried a different song, a sharper, more menacing howl that promised a winter of profound cruelty. The revelation came on a night in late September, when the first true frost laid a glittering shroud over the land. The fire in the hearth fought a losing battle against the drafts that snaked through the cabin's log walls. Annalise sat mending one of Thomas's old shirts, her fingers stiff with cold, while Martha stared into the flames, her face a mask of troubled memory. The old woman's knuckles were white where she gripped the head of her walking stick. "It will be a hard winter," Martha said, her voice a dry rasp. "The squirrels are hoarding twice the nuts, and the bark on the north side of the oaks is thick as a man's thumb." Old signs Annalise didn't look up from her sewing, though she felt the truth of her mother's words in the marrow of her bones. "I'll chop more wood." The reply was automatic, the refrain of her existence. Martha shook her head slowly, a gesture of profound weariness. "Wood will not be enough. Not for the cold that is coming. This cabin." It is a sieve for the wind. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the mournful cry of the wind. Then, Martha spoke again, her voice distant, as if pulling a memory from a deep well. "My grandfather, back in the old country, he spoke of the deep winters. Winters that could kill a village. They did not fight the cold. They went into the earth." Annalise paused, her needle hovering over the worn fabric. "Into the earth?" "Like a grave. Martha's eyes found hers, and for the first time that night, they held a spark of something other than fear. Not a grave, child. A womb. They called it a winter cellar. Dug deep under a house or a barn, where the frost could not reach. The earth holds a warmth of its own, a steady temperance. Down there, with a small, smart fire, a family could live through anything. She leaned forward, tapping her stick on the floorboards for emphasis. The earth is the best blanket God ever made. The idea was so alien, so primitive, that Annalise's first instinct was to dismiss it. But as the wind rattled the oiled parchment in the window frame and a wave of frigid air washed over her, the image took root. Under the barn. The barn was sturdy, its massive posts sunk deep. It would provide cover from the snow and the wind while she worked. It was a crazy, desperate idea, born of an old woman's fading memories. But it was also the first flicker of genuine hope she had felt in a year. A way to not just survive, but to defy the winter that had taken her husband. That night, Annalise did not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind, and in her mind, she was already digging. The grueling process began at dawn. Annalise chose a spot in the barn's rear corner, a place of perpetual shadow where the dirt floor was packed hard but not impossible. The first strike of the pickaxe was a shock to her system, the vibration jarring her teeth, the sound swallowed by the cavernous space. This was not garden soil. This was a stubborn, unforgiving earth laced with stones and roots. Her tools were Thomas's, a heavy pickaxe, a worn spade, and 2 sturdy wooden buckets. Her method was brutally simple. She would break the ground with the pick, her whole body thrown into each swing, then shovel the loosened dirt and rock into a bucket. When both buckets were full, she would haul them, one in each hand, their weight stretching her arms and burning her shoulders, out to the far end of the pasture. There, under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom or the encroaching dusk, she would scatter the earth, tamping it down with her boots so the pile never grew large enough to attract notice. It was a Sisyphean task. The hole grew by agonizing inches. Her hands, despite their calluses, blistered, broke open, and bled. She wrapped them in rags, but the abrasive dirt always found its way in, grinding into the raw flesh. Her back became a single, solid knot of pain. Every morning she woke with a groan, forcing her protesting muscles into motion. Martha was her silent, steadfast witness. The old woman would bring a chair from the cabin and sit just inside the great barn doors, her mending basket in her lap. She couldn't lift or dig, but her presence was a bulwark against despair. She would have a cup of hot, weak tea ready for Annalise's breaks. She would watch the sky for riders. And she would talk, filling the silence with stories of her grandfather, describing the shape of the shelter, the way the chimney should draw, the kind of stones they would need. "Patience, child," she would murmur, as Annalise slumped against a post, chest heaving. "You are not moving a mountain in a day. You are moving it one spoonful at a time." Days bled into weeks. The hole became a pit, then a room. She learned the language of the earth beneath her feet, the soft give of clay, the grating scrape of shale, the dull thud of a buried boulder that would take a day of sweat and leverage to unearth. She worked in solitude, the rhythm of her labor becoming a prayer, a meditation, a furious act of will against the coming dark. The social opposition began, as it often does, with a visit of feigned concern. Reverend Michael Parris, a man whose piety was matched only by his certainty, stopped by one afternoon with a basket of dry bread and a surplus of advice. He found Annalise by the barn, her dress hemmed with dirt, a smudge of mud on her cheek. He saw the strain in her face and the raw state of her hands. "My dear Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "a woman of your delicate nature should not be engaged in such coarse labor. It is unseemly. The town is beginning to talk." Annalise merely nodded, offering no explanation. His visit was the stone that started the avalanche of rumor. The mocking chorus, a group of young farmhands and layabouts, took to riding past her property, slowing their horses to shout. "Digging to China, widow. Better make it deep enough for 2. Their laughter echoed across the fields, sharp and cruel. Then came the skeptical expert, Mr. Alastair Finch. He was the town's only qualified builder, a man who believed progress was measured in milled lumber and perfectly square joints. Hearing the rumors, he appointed himself inspector. He marched into her barn, took one look at the burgeoning excavation, and scoffed. "What you are doing is suicide," he declared, his voice booming with authority. "You've compromised the entire structure. Those main posts need uniform support. A heavy snow, and this whole roof will come down on your head. This is the most foolhardy thing I have ever witnessed." He left shaking his head, and by evening, the entire town knew that the widow's barn was a death trap. The final piece of the opposition was the greedy authority, Mr. Reginald Croft, the banker who held the note on her land. He saw not a grieving widow, but an opportunity. An unstable woman engaged in dangerous and irrational behavior might be deemed unfit to manage her own property. He began making quiet inquiries, checking the fine print of his loan documents, looking for a clause, any clause, that would allow him to foreclose. The community, led by its three pillars, the moral, the practical, and the powerful, had passed its judgment. Annalise was not just a grieving widow, she was a madwoman, an embarrassment, and a problem to be solved. The confrontation came on a grey, blustery morning in late October. Annalise had just finished lining the lower walls of the pit with flat stones she'd hauled from the creek bed when the riders appeared. It was Mr. Croft, his face a mask of smug righteousness, flanked by the town constable and a grim-faced Mr. Finch. They dismounted with an air of official purpose, their boots crunching on the gravel. "Mrs. Miller," Croft began, foregoing any pleasantries, "we are here on a matter of public safety. Mr. Finch has filed a formal complaint regarding the structural integrity of this barn. He believes your project poses a clear and present danger to yourself and your property, on which, I might add, the bank has a considerable investment." Annalise stood before them, her spade held loosely in one hand. She was tired, her body ached, but her eyes were clear and steady. She did not speak. "We require a full inspection," Finch interjected, gesturing toward the barn. "If I find what I expect, we'll have a court order by noon to have this hole filled in for your own good." As they made to enter the barn, a frail figure appeared in the doorway of the cabin. It was Martha, leaning heavily on her stick. She moved with a slow, deliberate limp, her gaze fixed on the men. She stopped beside her daughter, a tiny, stooped woman facing down the town's authority. "You are concerned about the posts, Mr. Finch?" Martha's voice was surprisingly strong, cutting through the wind. Finch puffed out his chest. "I am concerned with sound engineering principles, which are clearly being violated." Martha took a slow step forward and tapped the base of one of the massive central posts with the tip of her stick. "My husband's father raised this barn. He learned from his father, who learned from his. They knew the earth. These posts," she tapped it again, a sound like a woodpecker's drum, "are sunk 10 feet deep, onto bedrock. They hold the roof. The walls of the barn are just a skin against the wind." She turned her gaze to Finch, her old eyes sharp. "My daughter has not dug within 5 feet of any main post. She is digging out the dead space between them. The earth she removes has no more bearing on this roof than a mouse burrowing in the corner. You look at the lumber, but you do not understand the foundation." There was a moment of stunned silence. Finch, the expert, had made his assessment from the edge of the pit, assuming a standard, shallow foundation. He had not considered the old ways, the deep-set knowledge of the pioneers. He had no answer. Croft sputtered, his legal challenge suddenly resting on nothing but bluster. They could not prove she was a danger. They had been outmaneuvered not by law or force, but by the quiet, unshakable truth of forgotten wisdom. They mounted their horses and rode away, their defeat hanging in the air like dust. With the official challenge rebuffed, the work took on a new urgency. Winter was no longer a distant threat, it was a presence, waiting just over the horizon. Annalise and Martha now focused on the two most crucial elements for survival, fire and food. The fireplace was Martha's design, a concept from memory made real by Annalise's unrelenting labor. The task of gathering the right stones was immense. They needed flat, dense rocks for the firebox, stones that would hold and radiate heat, and longer, thinner ones for the chimney flue. Annalise took their small wooden cart and made dozens of trips to the creek that bordered their property, wading into the frigid water to select each stone. She learned to read the rocks, feeling for hairline fractures that would crack under intense heat. Back in the shelter, she became a mason. Using a mortar of sticky clay dug from the creek bank mixed with sand and water, she laid the stones one by one. Martha sat on a stool at the edge of the pit, her stick pointing, her voice guiding. "No, child, that one is too proud. It will leave a gap. Find a flatter neighbor for it." Together, they built it, a deep firebox, a clever smoke shelf to prevent downdrafts, and a flue that snaked up one earthen wall, exiting discreetly through the barn's rear foundation. While the clay mortar dried, Annalise turned to the wood. Every hour that was not spent digging or building was spent with the axe. She felled dead trees on the property, bucking the logs and splitting them until a mountain of firewood grew against the barn's southern wall. She then hauled it, armload by armload, down the ladder into the shelter, stacking it neatly along an entire wall, a fortress of fuel. Food was the final bastion. Their root cellar was already stocked with potatoes, carrots, and onions from their small garden. Annalise spent weeks digging up the remaining vegetables. She salted the last of their cured pork, packing it in barrels. She traded her last few chickens for sacks of flour, beans, and cornmeal from the general store, ignoring the whispers and sideways glances of the townsfolk. The signs of the coming crisis were everywhere for those who knew how to look. The sky took on a strange, milky white pallor. The usual autumn birds vanished overnight. The squirrels disappeared entirely. A profound and unnatural stillness settled over the land, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm of immense power. The air grew thin and sharp, so cold it hurt to draw a deep breath. But in town, life went on. They trusted their sturdy cabins, their new iron stoves, their expert builder, and their righteous God. They saw the mad widow's frantic preparations and simply shook their heads in pity and scorn. The climax arrived not with a blizzard's roar, but with a silent, lethal plunge of the mercury. One evening, the temperature began to drop, and it did not stop. By midnight, it was 10 below zero. By dawn, it was 25 below, and still falling. A wind rose from the north, a blade that flayed the warmth from any exposed surface. It was a dry, clear cold, a crystalline killer that made the very air seem to crackle. In their shelter, Annalise and Martha were safe. The small, efficient fire in their stone hearth cast a warm, flickering glow over the earthen walls. A pot of venison stew bubbled gently, its rich aroma filling the small space. The earth around them, a constant 55 degrees, was a perfect insulator. The cold could not touch them. They sat in their subterranean haven, listening to the muffled scream of the wind above, secure in a bubble of warmth and life. Above ground, the world was freezing to death. The town was caught in a death grip. In the home of Mr. Finch, the builder, the modern chimney he had boasted of, built with precise angles and new mortar, contracted so violently in the cold that it cracked down the middle, filling his house with smoke and forcing his family to huddle in a single room, their breath pluming in the air. At the home of Reverend Paris, the great panes of imported window material in his parsonage grew brittle and shattered, letting the Arctic wind pour in as if the walls themselves had vanished. In the grand house of Mr. Croft, the banker and his wife, Eleanor, burned through their massive woodpile in a single day. They began burning furniture, chairs, tables, the fine mahogany desk where he had plotted Annalise's ruin. The suffering was universal. Livestock, caught in fields or poorly sealed barns, froze where they stood. The town's water pump froze solid. Frostbite was rampant. On the second night, with the temperature holding at a catastrophic 35 degrees below zero, a desperate, frantic pounding echoed from the barn door above. Annalise climbed the ladder, unbarred the door, and was met with a gust of soul-stealing cold. There stood Eleanor Croft, her face a mask of terror, her fine wool coat offering no protection. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was her young son, his face pale blue, his breathing a shallow, rattling gasp. "Please," Eleanor sobbed, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "He's so cold. The fire is gone. He won't make it to morning. They said you." They said you had a place. Annalise looked at the woman who had stood by while her husband tried to destroy her, then at the suffering child. Without a word of accusation or triumph, she stood aside and gestured toward the hidden trapdoor. Bring him down. The vindication was as quiet and absolute as the cold had been. For 3 more days, the polar air held the territory in its grip. In the warmth of the earthen shelter, Annalise tended to the Croft boy, feeding him warm broth and keeping him by the fire. Eleanor Croft sat in humbled silence, watching the woman her husband had called mad save her child's life. When the temperature finally began to rise, and the survivors of the town could emerge from their frozen homes, the story spread like wildfire. It was not a story of madness, but of miraculous foresight. They came in small, shame-faced groups to the Miller homestead. They saw the simple, ingenious shelter. They felt the lingering warmth radiating from the earth and stone. They saw the massive pile of firewood, the well-stocked larder, and understood the depth of their folly. Mr. Finch was the first of her tormentors to face her. He stood at the edge of the pit, his face grey with exhaustion and humility, his expert's arrogance stripped away. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw lumber and nails, and I didn't see the truth. The earth. It holds the heat. My books never taught me that." He looked at the stone fireplace, at the carefully stacked wood. "You and your mother. You have a wisdom my trade has forgotten." He offered to repair her cabin roof for free, an offer she quietly accepted. Reverend Parris came next. He did not speak of pride or of unseemly behavior. He spoke of the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, casting Annalise, to her quiet astonishment, in the role of the wise. He asked her to lead a prayer of thanks for the survivors, a public act of acknowledgement that stunned the congregation into silence. Mr. Croft never came. He sent a messenger with a notarized letter, formally forgiving the remaining debt on her land and signing the deed over to her, free and clear. It was an act not of generosity, but of profound, unspoken shame. The mockery was replaced by awe. The women of the town came to Annalise, asking about her mother's knowledge, about preserving food, about how to read the signs of the coming seasons. The men came to learn about building with stone and earth. Annalise, who had been an outcast, became the quiet, respected heart of her community. She had not sought victory, only survival. But in surviving, she had shown them all a truth they had chosen to ignore, that the oldest wisdom is often the most profound. The legacy of the winter cellar became woven into the fabric of the community. That spring, Annalise did not fill in the shelter. Instead, she helped 3 other families dig their own, guiding them with the knowledge her mother had passed down. The widow's folly became known as the Miller cellar, and soon, no new homestead was considered complete without one. The structures were a testament to a lesson learned in the bitterest of cold, that true security came not from pride or modern convenience, but from a humble respect for the power of the earth. Annalise lived a long and peaceful life on her land. She never remarried, finding a different kind of fulfillment in her role as a keeper of the old ways. She cared for Martha for 10 more years, and when her mother finally passed, it was peacefully, in her sleep, during a mild winter, tucked warmly in her bed in the cabin above the shelter that had saved them. Annalise became the town's matriarch, a figure of quiet strength and deep wisdom, her hands forever marked by the memory of the earth she had moved. She passed away in her 70th year, leaving the farm to the descendants of the Croft boy, whose life she had saved. Generations passed. The town grew, the railroad came, and the old ways were once again forgotten in a rush of new technologies. The barn eventually fell, its great timbers returning to the soil. The cabin was torn down. The land was sold and subdivided. But the shelter remained, a hollow place in the earth, its entrance collapsing and slowly filling with dirt and leaves, its story fading into local legend. A century later, a young architectural historian from a university back east was surveying the area, studying early pioneer construction techniques. She came across an old property map that made a strange notation. Miller cellar. Intrigued, she found the spot and, after a week of careful, archaeological digging, she broke through into the darkness. There it was. The stone fireplace, still black with soot. The earthen walls, packed as hard as rock. the elegant, simple design that had harnessed the geothermal energy of the planet with nothing more than stone, clay, and immense effort. She stood in the silent, cool space, overwhelmed. In her report, she would call it a masterpiece of vernacular architecture, a work of intuitive environmental design. She would never know the full story of the scorn, the desperation, and the quiet, unyielding courage that had built it. But the truth of its wisdom, buried for 100 years, had endured, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. It was a final, silent vindication, a testament to a woman who listened to her mother, trusted the earth, and faced down the storm. Share a story in the comments about a time you trusted old wisdom over modern advice. And if her story of resilience moved you, subscribe for more tales of those who dared to stand alone.